Hello and welcome to Corbett's Comments. Today I'll be commenting on Romans chapter 8, verse 28 from the perspective of the unwanted blessing. An old saying is that into each life some rain must fall. Now, I have been rained on in at least a dozen states of the United States and in 8 other countries, and it's always been a cold and uncomfortable experience. The phrase raining on my parade shows that rain can be a negative experience, even though we know our farmers need rain for their crops. Now, when bad things happen in our lives, it is like spiritual and emotional rain. Paul helps us to understand how God would have us see these things in Romans chapter 8. So let's look on this today and be both encouraged and enlightened. First, we need to see, though, the reality of suffering. We only have to look around us to see suffering in our world. As I write this in July of 2020, we are still in the midst of a global pandemic caused by the COVID-19 virus. Millions have been sickened and hundreds of thousands of people have died. Global economies and people's ways of life have been upset, and yet after 6 months of work, we still don't have a vaccine. And besides that, COVID-19 is not the only issue that besets us. Because we still vividly remember the attacks of 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina and the April 2011 tornado outbreaks, as well as many other natural and man-made disasters. I recently read of a church planter who was hit and killed by a vehicle while trying to help another motorist whose car had caught fire. We also only have to look in the Bible to see suffering. Now, a prime example of this, of course, is Job, as we see in Job chapter 1, verses 13 through 20. One day, when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head, and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Now, if all that was not trouble enough, let's see more of Job's travail in chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. "So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores, from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat amongst the ashes." Now, Job, of course, was not the only character in the Bible to see suffering. David, who had been anointed by God as king of Israel, was falsely accused by Saul and mercilessly persecuted by him. Later in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 24 through 28, Paul describes the difficulties that he had faced in serving God. "5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea, and I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Now, our greatest example of suffering, of course, is that of Jesus Christ himself, who was sinless and who had blessed many people during his ministry, and yet he was beaten, scourged, and crucified. And we only have to look into our own lives to see suffering as well. Sickness, betrayal, unemployment, conflict are common experiences. Not for nothing did the psalmist say that our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures, yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow. Or put another way, life is pain, said Wesley in the movie The Princess Bride. Anyone who says otherwise is selling something. So now let's turn our attention to the human rationale for suffering. Because humans have tried to explain and understand suffering from the beginning of time. The theology of suffering is called theodicy. Theo equals God and dike equals righteousness. It explains why God is righteous even though people suffer. Some say that only sinners suffer. Now this is not biblical. Job was said to be blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. We know that Jesus was perfect and without sin, and yet both he and Job suffered tremendously. No, this idea is too simplistic. A cursory examination of the world system reveals that prosperity does not equal righteousness. Some say that God is too weak to prevent suffering. He is good, but incapable of keeping bad things from happening to good people. This cannot be true of the God of the Bible, who is presented as the creator and sustainer of the universe and who is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and omnibenevolent. Some say that God is either partially or wholly evil in his essence, and this too cannot be true of the God of the Bible, who died for our sins. It can't be true of the God who wept over Lazarus' grave. It can't be true of the God who loved the little children. It can't be true of God who knows the numbers of hairs on our heads and who cares if a sparrow falls. Finally, some say that suffering is illusory, that it doesn't really exist. Now, this is simply a denial of reality. My dad used to say, when all else fails, read the instructions. So what does the Bible, our instruction book, tell us about suffering? So finally, let's consider God's reasons for suffering. Now, God does not cause suffering. That comes from human sin. But God does make lemonade when life sends us lemons. Let's consider Romans 8:28, which says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Now, as we parse this verse, some facts stand out. The first fact, all things, means anything that we can imagine. Next, works for good means for our ultimate benefit. And finally, to those who love him means that these provisions apply only to members of his family. So, whatever comes into our lives, death, unemployment, conflict, disputes, traffic jams, illnesses, God can and will use these things to bless us. This has caused author Philip Yancey to call suffering the unwanted blessing. Because while it is painful, suffering also brings us a blessing we can receive in no other way. As James 1 verse 2 tells us, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." So, will we always understand step by step exactly what God is trying to do through the circumstances of our lives? No. Job didn't understand. David didn't understand. Paul didn't understand. And the question also is, do we need to understand? No. We just need to know and trust him. We don't know what our doctors know, but we trust that they're working to heal us, and the same is true for God. One of the greatest promises of Christ applies directly to this discussion. In John 10:10, Jesus told us of his purpose. He said that the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. Have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Jesus wants to give us abundant life. And while we know that this can happen on earth, it definitely will happen to all of his family in the hereafter in heaven. This is what Jesus taught us in John 14, verses 1 and 2, when he said, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would have I told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you?" And of course, the answer is no. In conclusion, we need to understand that suffering is the unwanted blessing. God's work in our life is like a star in the night sky. Its light disappears at dawn, but it is still there unseen. C.S. Lewis, who knew a thing or two about suffering, said, "We are all faced with a series of great opportunities brilliantly disguised as impossible situations." All of these things make sense if we know and trust our God. The question is, do you? Thank you for watching. Every blessing. I'm Dr. Otis Corbett.